It's on?
Yeah.
Can you hear it? Doesn't seem to pick it up much.
¿Sabe, no?
No? Yes, yes, yes. No, no, no.
Bueno.
Bueno, bueno, bueno.
Bueno.
Bueno, bueno. Bueno, bueno.
Bueno. Bueno.
¿Se oye? ¿No se oye? Sí se oye. ¿Sí? Bueno.
¿Me pueden oír? Pues, it is an honor and a great pleasure to introduce Paul Davis. Paul Davis has been a mentor, has helped me with my MA, has helped me study my MA program. So of course I have lots of things to thank Paul for. Paul graduated from Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland. He received an MA in Linguistics from the University of Reading. He is co-author of a book that many of us know, that's Paul's Success in English Teaching, published by Oxford University Press. And Paul has been here in Mexico for 51 years, right? He began teaching in our university. So his first post was our university, and then he moved to the Anglo-Mexicano de Cultura. He has participated actively in professionalization in English teaching in Mexico. He led the reforms in national public secondary school education, the beginning of textbook publication specific to Mexico, and the founding of Mextesol. He was a past president of Mextesol, a textbook author, and the author of many articles in TESOL in Mexico. During the 90s, and because of the British Council and its agreements with the SEP, he taught the Certificate of Overseas Teachers of English, the Cambridge Coach course, in different states in Mexico, and other courses, including Open PX. Paul Davis continues to be part of the evolution of English language teaching in Mexico, and has most recently been working with the Universidad Hidalgo and the Universidad Iberoamericana in Puebla. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think it's working. Is it working? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Is it being... Yes. No. Yes? You can hear it? Yes, I think it's just beginning to pick up, right? Yeah, good. My talk today is related obviously to my talk yesterday, where I substituted Liliana. But this is a bit more historical. The talk yesterday was focused principally on methodology within teacher training. This is a bit more general, and it's the development of English teacher training in Mexico specifically. I have never taken an English teacher's course in my life. And that's basically because I'm too old. When I started teaching English, there were no English teacher courses, teacher training courses. There were no BAs in Britain or the United States or anywhere. Applied linguistics as a BA didn't really begin until the 1960s, 70s. And so there were no licenciaturas in teaching foreign languages, teaching English as a foreign language. There were no short courses. I've given many courses, but never taken one. Let's look historically then first at the availability of English teacher training in Mexico. Before the 1960s, the only way you could get any formal professional training in English language teaching was in the Normal Superior in Mexico City. I'm not sure whether they had courses, I imagine, around the country as well in other Normales Superiores. But that was the only way you could get formal professional training as an English teacher. In the 1960s, I arrived in Mexico myself in 1965, and as Fatima said, I taught for 2 years in this university, and then I went to the Anglo-Mexican Institute in Mexico City. And in the 1960s, the Anglo-Mexican Institute had occasional seminars for English teachers, and the North American, the Instituto Mexicano Norteamericano de Cultura, which was very important, very, very important in the 1960s and afterwards, but it doesn't exist now, they gave occasional seminars. And that, in fact, is how I got a job in the Anglo after 2 years here, because you probably remember I arrived in 1965. 1967, there was trouble beginning, and it came to a head in 1968. Student trouble, university trouble. And at the end of 1967, this university closed for several months because of the student problems. There was no money, no salary, and so I waited for a month, 2 months, 3 months, and ran out of money, and I looked for a job. And I found a job in the university. Eventually paid us a bit late, but the university eventually paid for the time we were under contract. So I looked for a job, and I had been to a few seminars, a few Anglo seminars, so they knew me. And that's how I got a job fairly easily in the Anglo in Mexico. But that's what there was. And towards the end of the 1960s, the first formal courses began at the Anglo and at the Instituto Mexicano Norteamericano de Cultura, de Relaciones Culturales. They were short courses. We talked yesterday about short courses, medium courses, and 4-year courses. They were short courses. They were, 50-hour, 100-hour courses for English teachers. And obviously there were also courses that only took people who already spoke English well. And so if you didn't have a minimum B2, C1 level of English, you couldn't take those courses. And so that was the beginning of teacher training, English teacher training in Mexico, apart from the Normal Superior. And the Normal Superior was very special, obviously, because it was directed specifically towards secondary schools, secondary school teachers. So that's when it began, in the 1960s. In the 1970s, the courses in the Anglo and in the Mexican North American Institute were expanded. There were more courses. We started having courses for beginning teachers and for teachers with some experience, and slightly longer courses. And in 1972 it was, 1972-73, in the Anglo, we gave the first Cambridge course. It wasn't actually Cambridge at that time, it was RSA, Royal Society of Arts. We gave the very first Royal Society of Arts, which became Cambridge, teaching course. And I was a teacher, a trainer on that course, and the RSA gave myself and a colleague, Richard Rosner. Some of you may have come across Richard Rosner. He's now, I think he's still working at it, he's now director of, I think it's called Equals, the testing organization of Europe. He asked the RSA if we could give the course and get the certificate from the course. So I graduated from the course I gave. We were evaluated by British Council staff. So it wasn't, too incestuous and so on. So I graduated. Teacher's certificate I have is the RSA Cambridge certificate, and I graduated from the course that I gave. So it's pretty, people today, they don't realize that people like me, we grew up to the age of 12, 13, 14 with no television. People don't realize, and no English training until the 1970s. 1980s, things started developing much more. In the 1980s, you started getting institutes, chains of institutes like Interlingua, Harman Hall, etc., which hadn't existed before. And they became competition for the Anglo, commercial competition for the Anglo and for the Mexican North American Institute caused us a great deal of trouble, but contributed quite a lot to the oferta of English language courses in Mexico. And they had their own methods, and they trained teachers for their institutes. And I believe they continue to do so. So they train specifically for teaching in interlingua, or specifically for teaching in quick learning, or specifically for teaching in Harmon Hall, etc. So that was a new thing added, because you started getting teachers who took the interlingua, Harmon Hall, quick learning was later, I think, course, and they would teach there for a while, and then they would work somewhere else. So you started getting people who were teaching in different places, possibly including this university, whose teacher training was interlingua training or Harmon Hall training, short courses. Also in the 1980s, you started getting the Universidad Autónoma licenciaturas in whatever they called it, applied linguistics or whatever, but basically it was English language teaching. Does anybody know or can remember when the licenciatura began here? 1984? 1984. So the licenciatura began here in 1984. There was nothing before it. Obviously, beginning with 4-year licenciaturas, you're going to get a very different approach from the Anglo, the Relaciones Culturales, and the short courses in the commercial institutes. They were you're no longer thinking in terms of 50, 100 hours, 150 hours, 200, 100 hours for people who spoke English very well and would go into the classroom teaching. 4 years, well, you have to fill the 4 years, don't you? Lots of materias. And so you have to think, well, oh God, 4 years, what do we do? How do we fill the time? Well, one way the time was filled, obviously, was because the autonomous universities took people with little or no English. And so a lot of the time was actually teaching people English. I commented on that yesterday. And obviously, being a licenciatura, you would start going into things which you didn't go into in the short courses. So you'd start going into background theory, linguistic theory and learning theory, and you go into testing. The teachers in the Anglo and the Relaciones Culturales and Interlingua and Harmon Hall, they didn't write tests. The tests were provided by the institution. So you didn't have to go into evaluation or testing in those short courses. But when you get the licenciaturas, well, you start having all these different areas that you go into. So 1984 in this university. Did you know that? Did you all know that the licenciatura began in 1984? And I think it was one of the first ones, wasn't it? It was one of the first ones, yeah. In the 1990s, again, things started developing a lot. You started getting nationwide Cambridge Coty courses. And both Fatima and myself and other people were involved in those courses. And I had students like Julio, and you did the Coty course, didn't you? Yes, that's right, and other people here in the 1990s. It was the British Council in liaison with the CEP and with the different universities. And I knew Mexico pretty well by then. I'd been here for a long time. But it was a way to learn more about the country and feel the country and the universities much more. Because we started off those Coty courses with almost exclusively university English teachers. And we had an area, and my area was Puebla, Veracruz, Guerrero, and I went off and did some courses in other places, Zacatecas. I gave 2 courses in Zacatecas. Mexicali, I know Mexicali quite well. I gave 2 Coty courses in Mexicali. And later, as most of the university English teachers had taken Coty, they started opening the Coty courses to outside people. And so we started getting secondary school teachers and preparatory teachers and private school teachers, teachers from the Oriente and teachers from et cetera. And in the Coty courses, you had to observe the teacher in the teacher's workplace for 4 observations. And so I would observe all of these teachers. I'd have people to help me, a few people to help me, but I did most of the observations. And I would go 10 kilometers up a dirt track, terracería, to secundaria, whatever it was. And so I began to observe, and I observed thousands of classes. And so I began to observe classes in autonomous universities, in public secondary schools, in private primary schools, in you name it, in every place, in big cities, in small towns. I used to go on trips, driving down, because of the COTI courses I gave in Jalapa, Veracruz, Orizaba, Córdoba, several courses in all of those places, and some of the teachers would be teaching in Coatzacoalcos or in Tuxtla or whatever, and I'd go and visit classes in all of those places. It was a fantastic experience. Professional experience, teacher training, observing classes in all sorts of places, and also a cultural experience and learning more about Mexico. Now, what have we got now? Well, we've got the Normal Superior, continues. We'll be looking at normal training in a moment, a little bit more. We've got the Universidad Autónoma. We've got a few other universities. I believe, for example, that the Universidad del Valle de Puebla has a BA or an MA or something, and so there's some private places also now offering licenciaturas in English teaching. We've got the Cambridge courses given by not just the Anglo, but International House and other places here at the different levels of Cambridge courses. The Anglo courses continue. I designed, they've probably changed now, but back at the beginning of this century, 2000 or something or other, I designed the 3 English courses for the Anglo, a basic introductory course, the central course, and an advanced course. And I'm sure, and of course, still the short courses of Interlingua, Harman Hall, and so on, and probably some other things. So we've got a very big range. So when we come from 1960 down to now, half a century, the panorama has changed totally. It's a totally different panorama in teacher training. It's also a totally different panorama in actual English teaching, because we've now got English in public primary schools, although I believe it's not going very well, but we have English in public primary schools. The unfortunate thing is we have much more English language teaching, but the results, quite honestly, the results are not much better than back in the 1960s or 70s. They are significantly better in some places, in university language centers. In university language centers, your language centers, the results are significantly better than they were back in the old days. But in tronco común, I'm not so sure. So things have changed. Dominant English language teaching methodology in English teacher training. I'm thinking specifically of Mexico, but I'm sure it's similar well, I know it's similar in other places around Latin America. Because of the books I've published and have been promoted, I've been to Brazil many, many times, Peru a number of times, Colombia and several places, Uruguay once. A long time ago, 1980 something, around about 1980. We have a mutual friend, Richard Cowley, yeah. So the dominant English language teaching methodology in English teacher training. I talked a lot about that yesterday, so I'll go quickly. But pre-1960 or early 1960s, it was grammar translation and or audiolingual method. And that's what the Normal Superior was doing. The Normal Superior was, showing teachers how to explain the grammar of English and how to drill the grammar of English. So it was grammar translation and audiolingual method. In the Relaciones Culturales, which the American Institute was called, it was audiolingual method. In the Anglo, it was what we call situational language teaching, which is kind of communicative audiolingual method. And so it was very much based on structural grammar, the different structures of the verb to be, affirmative, I am, you are, etc., 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 the interrogative, am I, are you, etc., etc., the negative, questions, answers, and so on, and behaviorist psychology, model, imitation, repetition, drilling. In the 1970s, Chomsky had filtered through to English language teaching his very, very influential review of what's his name's, I can't remember that, it begins with an S. Skinner, that's right, I said it begins with an S. I'm getting to that age now where, it's on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember. Chomsky's very influential review of Skinner's book on language learning, was 1959, I think it was. But slowly Chomsky filtered through and people began to think, why do we stop our students from making errors? So all the practice has to be controlled, because if you have uncontrolled practice, you put pairs of students to talk, they'll make mistakes. Oh my God, we can't have mistakes, kind of defend us against mistakes. And so people were beginning to think, well, why should we stop students from making mistakes? When they go out of the classroom and try to use English outside, they'll start making mistakes immediately. And little children make mistakes, learning their first language. And so learning, making mistakes is part of language learning, it's part of the process. And so we have to find out how to manage it and exploit it, not stop it, and therefore stop people communicating in English. And so that was filtering through, and it kind of led to a kind of upgrade of situational language teaching, which the Relaciones Culturales by then, their audiolingual teaching had turned into a kind of situational language teaching. They had, look at the British, look at the Anglo, they're doing what we're doing, audiolingual method, but it's more communicative, it's more meaningful, it's more, perhaps we should be doing that, and they started doing that. So we had a kind of Chomskyan upgrade of situational language teaching in the Relaciones Culturales, in the Anglo, and the idea of LAD, language acquisition device. Language learning is a process in the learner's head, not a kind of army drilling process. That was filtering through. So things began to change. We started getting, for the first time ever in the 1970s, pair work. We hadn't graduated to group work in the Anglo, but pair work where the students were allowed to, within the topic, within the task, to do what they wanted to. Not repeat the dialogue in pairs, and whatever. Uncontrolled pair practice. And nobody died. There were no fatalities, and it actually seemed that, the classroom atmosphere actually got a bit better in some ways, and people were learning a bit better. Elsewhere, it was probably outside the Anglo and the Relaciones Culturales, it was probably traditional situational language teaching in the teacher. I'm not sure, can anybody here remember what kind of methodology you were recommending in the licenciatura? Oh, this is 1970 still, no licenciatura. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. 1980s. Well, by the 1980s, you started getting communicative language teaching, which was based on a new view of language, the idea of looking at language from the point of view of the notions it conveyed, the ideas, concepts, and the functions, communicative, persuading, inviting, thanking, etc., that it was used for. I did my master's at the University of Reading in England, and David Wilkins was one of the people there. And I did my master's in 1971, 1972, but already this new view of language was coming through, and David Wilkins was one of the people who was very much involved in it, and of course it went into the Common European Framework from there. So weak CLT was coming in, kind of notional functional upgrade of situational language teaching. And the textbooks changed totally. Before this, the contents of the textbook was to be, I am not, structures. And then suddenly, in the 1980s, all of those books became history, and the new books had a column with functions, exchanging personal information, etc., asking about this, asking about that, doing this, doing that. A lot of the functions that are put into these columns of the contents of books are in fact not really functions, they're actually notions, but we won't worry about that. Life is complicated enough already. And so we started getting weak CLT. 1981 was a key year in communicative language teaching. 3 books were published. The first book on communicative language teaching, called Communicative Language Teaching by William Littlewood, 1981. A book called Teaching English Through English by Jane Willis, 1981. And another book called Classroom English by Arthur Hughes, who was mentioned by Ellen. You here, Ellen, anywhere? No? Not here. Oh, I went to your talk. What? No, that's not. Who was actually mentioned in her talk in relation to testing, because he's also a testing man. But Littlewood presented a kind of a new basis for language teaching with communicative language teaching based on functions and notions rather than structures. Although, of course, you can still look at language from a structural perspective. Even if you're doing communicative language teaching, you can still look at language from to some extent from a structural perspective. But the actual methodology that he was kind of presenting was really what became called eventually PPP. It was really presentation, production, practice, production. That was 1981. How long ago is that? 20, 30, 34 years, 35 years. 35 years ago, PPP. And the 2 books on Classroom English, Teaching English Through English, Jane Willis, and Classroom English by Arthur Hughes, in methodology previously there had been approaches which excluded the first language, the direct method. You know, never use the first language, excluded the first language. These books were not on that principle of excluding the first language. They were rather of exploiting classroom communication for teaching the target language. And so the idea is that you shouldn't exclude the first language, but you should reduce it to a minimum when necessary. And you should not just use English in the classroom, in a sense, but you should use it as a part of your teaching. So that classroom English, establishing classroom English and doing classroom English is maybe 10%, 20%, 25% of your teaching of the language. Because the students learn routine commands, routine congratulations, how to ask questions, etc., etc., etc. So that classroom English is a fundamental part of communicative language teaching, not just doing it, but exploiting it. And as I say, these 3 books were published in the same year. I can't remember the exact year, but I think it was also possibly even 1979 or 1980, 1981, Relaciones Culturales, the Instituto Mexicano Norteamericano de Relaciones Culturales, published one of the first functional books in the world. And it was taken up by Longman and published internationally by Longman. So it was Relaciones Culturales Longman. I can't remember, it was 1979, 80, 81? 83, right. Well, that's probably when it went international, but it was, in use here before that. Yeah. And it was, so the Relaciones Culturales had come a long way. Relaciones Culturales had come from audiolingual method, situational language teaching, through to functional teaching, communicative functional based teaching. and it happened in Mexico. And afterwards you got Brian Abbs and other people. That's right, around about the same time maybe, but yeah. And things started going communicative. But I've called it weak communicative language teaching because it is kind of PPP communicative language teaching, which is still directed in a sense, kind of at least 50% of the attention, probably more, is on the language and the language systems rather than on communication as such. 1990s, well, all this started coming through much more strongly. Stronger communicative language teaching. You started getting TBL, Jane Willis again. Remember Jane Willis, Teaching English Through English, 1981? Jane Willis, 1996, Task-Based Learning, and contributing to Challenge and Change in Language Teaching, a very important book. And these things started coming into the COTI syllabus. I hadn't really thought much about task-based learning, didn't know much about it until I got the book. But even before that, I think, before 1996, the idea of task-based learning and consciousness raising, inductive work on language rather than pay attention to the teacher and, etc., etc. It had come through to the COTI syllabus. The COTI is now ICELT. The COTI has been replaced by ICELT, if you're not familiar with that. Now, well, it depends where. What is the dominant methodology in English teacher training? It depends where. I suspect that in most places it's kind of weak CLT still, kind of PPP. Would you say that's the case in the Licenciatura here in this university? Or is it more communicative? You're not sure? Well, anyway, think about it. But in some places like the Anglo, it has gone much more communicative. So the history of PPP, well, I've mentioned already that its roots, well, in some ways you can say its roots were in situational language teaching, actually. Presentation, practice, production. And remember, production is not really communicative. Production is kind of semi-communicative tasks containing the target language, not communicative tasks containing any language. Remember yesterday, those of you who were here yesterday, I said, you cannot predict the grammar of my next sentence. There's no way you can predict the grammar of my next sentence. And that's communication. You cannot predict what's coming next. You cannot predict what language is coming next. In some contexts it's more predictable, but in general you cannot predict what grammar, vocabulary, notions, functions are coming next. And so the last P of PPP, production, is not really communicative. It's still basically getting repetition practice of the target grammar, target whatever it is. So it was basic to situational language teaching. The only thorough published account I know, although it's very, very, everybody talks about PPP, but the only thorough published account I know is in At the Chalk Face, Practical Techniques in Language Teaching, Matthews, Spratt, Dangerfield, 1985. And there's a table of it. Yeah. Presentation, practice and production at a glance. In the book there are in fact 2 chapters or 3 chapters on PPP, and this is a kind of summarizing table. So presentation, practice and production at a glance, presentation, I can't read it here, but purpose, important features, typical activities, practice, production. And so if you think PP is the way to teach English, okay, I have got nothing against PPP in appropriate use, in context, etc. But it's certainly not cutting edge, the latest and best in English language teaching. It's old. It's very old. There was a big shift in progressive ELT methodology, which I've referred to already. when task-based learning came in. People today also talk about task-based learning, and they have no idea really of what task-based learning is. They think task-based learning is another way to teach grammar. No. Task-based learning is a way to get students doing communicative tasks using the language, which gives evidence of what problems and needs they have, and on the basis of the evidence of the problems and needs they have with the language, you then focus on language. And you focus on language inductively through consciousness raising. Not pay attention, I'm going to explain the grammar to you, no, but through consciousness raising approach. So Challenge and Change in Language Teaching, edited by Dave Willis. I see we've got...
It was Jane and Dave both.
Yeah, I got my dates all wrong. This got mixed up somewhere. Edited by Dave Lewis, Guillen, Dave Willis, Jane Willis, etc. Somehow that got in there somewhere. It should be down below. It got a bit mixed up. And of course, as I said before, the concepts there. Michael Lewis is the lexical approach guy, if you've heard of the lexical approach, which kind of says that rather than working from grammar, and by working on grammar you start including vocabulary, we should really work from lexis, which is where little children start from. Little children start from lexis as they begin to learn their first language, and the lexis has grammar and kind of works with grammar, and so you work towards grammar from lexis rather than working on grammar and including lexis. So a lot of new ideas and concepts came in here. And of course, these ideas have gone through to the Cambridge English courses. I say the book doesn't include Jeremy Harmer, who also worked in Mexico for a long time. But if you look at the later editions of the Practice of English Language Teaching, which is probably the best-selling methodology book of all time, if you look at the later editions of that, you'll find all of these concepts included, all of these new ideas included. Jeremy Harmer and the Practice of English Language Teaching left PPB behind a long time ago. It's there as a kind of optional technique, but it's not the way to go. Even in early editions of the Practice of English Language Teaching, on work on language, the idea was to elicit language from the students, see how many were fairly good with it, see how many had problems, and decide how you would work on the language. So a kind of diagnostic approach rather than this is the grammar of the unit. But teacher, I already know it. Shut up. This is the grammar of the unit. That kind of approach becomes more appropriate and significant the higher you go up. If you start teaching English in secondary school, you can pretty well bet that 99% of the students know little or no English. But when you get to intermediate level, you don't know what English language learning experience or use experience different students have. So when you come to teaching the second conditional, you can bet that there's somebody in the class who already can handle the second conditional pretty well. Maybe a lot of people in the class who can already handle the second conditional well. And so part of this movement, in a sense, is learner-centered teaching as well. And so you shouldn't approach, certainly intermediate and up, you shouldn't approach it from the point of view, this is the syllabus, this is what's in the book, you do it. I don't care whether you know it already or not. You should approach it from the point of view of, you're my students, some of you know things other people don't know, etc. Let's see what you know, and let's do what is necessary. And this is a bit from it. It's actually Skian bashing PPP and saying we need an alternative approach, which is kind of task-based approach. English teacher training methodology, because within English teacher training we have to work on English teaching methodology. But there's also the question of English teacher training methodology. How do you train the teachers? Okay, so we've got methodology and techniques for training. Pre-1960, Normal Superior, well, they didn't really know what they were doing. They had a lot of English literature. Okay, I've got nothing against English literature. I studied English literature and Spanish literature at university. But in today's world, it's great if English teachers are interested in English literature. By English literature, I mean, of course, literature in English, not just of the English, American, Canadian, Australian, Nigerian, Indian, etc. If teachers are interested in literature in English, great. But you don't really need it to be a good English teacher in Mexico. And they did a lot of that in the Normal Superior, and a lot of traditional grammar, prescriptive grammar, etc., etc., etc. And I imagine, I really don't know, a lot of the teaching was kind of, you know, lecture, classroom style. You know, listen to the teacher and take notes, rather than practical stuff. Although the Normal Superior has probably always had this thing about pasantes, you know, going and observing and working in secondary schools, right? So there's always been that kind of practical element. In the courses I mentioned previously, the Anglo and Relaciones Culturales courses, short courses, there will be a little background theory, behaviorist learning theory, structuralist grammar, and a lot of practice of teaching steps. Because by that time, situational language teaching was kind of pretty rigid and pretty fixed, PPP. And so literally, you would have teachers preparing a little bit of teaching, whatever stage of teaching it was, standing up, doing the teaching using the other trainees as students, trying to remember step 1, step 2, step 3, trying to do it, and then having it analyzed afterwards. I mentioned this yesterday. So it was very much a kind of drilling approach. This is the way to do it. Step 1, step 2, step 3, these techniques in sequence, etc. This is the only way to do it, and you have to be able to do it in the classroom. Okay, I think probably most of us believe in a much more flexible approach to teaching, and so on, responding to what happens, and so on. But if you're a teacher with weak English in a public secondary school, maybe that kind of thing helps you to survive a little bit. So we shouldn't kind of throw it out entirely. We hope that's not happening in the University Language Centre, but it might be one way of surviving from day to day in a public secondary school. 1970s, a bit more theory, so we started getting free pair work, etc. So a little bit more time spent on theory and new theory, kind of changing ideas, new theories. So a bit of kind of, you know, listen and take notes and read this and read that. But the rest was the same. Kind of understanding languages, structures, and learning the steps for presentation, practice, production, learning how to handle listening, learning how to handle reading, learning how to handle writing, and so on. And a lot of actual practice. 1980s, even more theory, because more theory had come in. A lot more theory in some places, like universities, I would imagine. Notional functional grammar and so on. But in Anglo-type courses and interlingua-type courses, all of this practice continues a lot. Now, I'm not sure how much practice you get in a licenciatura here, actual doing it. Do you get a lot? Quite a lot? Yeah, good, good. 1990s, even more. So from here, forgetting the norma superior, from here where it was a little theory, reading, listening to lectures on them, and a lot of kind of lesson planning and practice of steps and repetition practice really for teachers, repetition practice of teachers, we come down now to a lot more theory, more reading, a lot of other things, and maybe in some places less actual practice, I'm not sure. So, this is methodology. As teachers in the licenciatura, many of you are in the licenciatura, or pasantes, or graduates of the licenciatura. Did you do a lot of drilling of teaching? Drilling of teaching steps? No? You didn't? No. That may be good, it may be bad, I don't know. English teacher training and ELT context in Mexico. I mentioned this yesterday, but it's very important to know who you're teaching, how much time you have. Remember I mentioned these three things yesterday: profile of trainees, time available, and where are they going to teach? What is the target context? It's very important to have an idea of that. Some places have a very strong idea of that, interlingua, Harmon Hall, quick learning and so on. Some places have a slightly less clear idea of it, but they try to kind of organize things, the Anglo. So the Anglo has courses for kind of introduction to English teaching, teaching children, even teaching young children, I think. So they've got teacher training courses which are focused on specific teaching contexts, ELT contexts. The licenciatura, it's kind of for everybody, you know, teaching anywhere, anything, and so maybe, if you don't have them now, maybe you should have materias opcionales, which is teaching children, teaching in public school, teaching in, so that people begin to understand what contexts there are out there which you're going to look for a job in. And so, you know, if you're inclined towards children, you take that module, that thing on teaching children. If you don't want children or adolescents, it's only adults. You know, if you can't teach adults, I'm not going to work. If it's only adults, we're teaching adults, and so on. And teaching in difficult conditions. So we have age of learners, young children, older children, teenagers, adults. Need of English, unlikely, possible, probable, already. Let's face it. We have everything is globalization nowadays, isn't it? We were talking yesterday, outsourcing is globalized. Even some people who work in this university maybe are outsourced. They're not actually, contracted directly by the university. Volkswagen, a lot of people in Volkswagen don't work for Volkswagen. They work for a company that does Volkswagen's accounting, or that cleans Volkswagen, or that puts the cars on madrinas. The people who drive the Volkswagen cars onto madrinas, the big trucks, they're not employees of Volkswagen. I know one. They're outsourced. And so that's global. That's gone global. What else? Cyclists in cities. Look at this city. Pistas de ciclaje, pasos a desnivel, bicicletas. Últimamente no he visto. Me paré un día y no pasó ningún bicicleta. But it's global, isn't it? It's globalized. So, we do it because, ninguna bicicleta, pero ¿qué? Pues ¿qué importa, no? Tenemos que estar a la altura de Amsterdam. Yeah. So everything goes globalized. And one of the things that has gone globalized is everybody needs English, universal English. And so it's, lingüe. And,
Very well. Colombia very well.
Oh yeah? Right. I don't...
Change it again
Well, they put a lot of resources into it. They got a lot of exchange agreements with the states and so on. But the last time I looked, it wasn't going very well, actually. No. the results. I mean, a lot of activity, a lot of things they're doing, but the results, from what I could see, were not very good. And again, it's a global movement. But unfortunately, it's led to a massification of English language teaching, where a lot of the people, it's very unlikely, or almost impossible, that they'll ever need English. How many Germans speak English at a functional level? Eurobarometer has statistics on this, and at a kind of functional level, what would that be? B1, B2 maybe, kind of minimum. It's about 60% of Germans. So there are 40% of Germans who survive without that. They don't need it. France, 39% or something like that, I think it's 39%, France. So there are 61% of the French population who survive without English. Spain, 22%. So there are 78% of the population of Spain who survive without English. Mexico, Uruguay, I don't know. We don't know because we don't have any research that the Europeans have. But Mitofsky and some people have done some stuff, and it seems to be somewhere in the region of 5, maybe 10% maximum, but it seems to be in the region of 5%. Okay, that is not enough. We need more. But we don't need 100%. We don't even need 50%. We want something more like Spain or France. We want 20%, 30%, 40%. Because most Mexicans will never need English in their lives. Most Mexicans. I'm talking about all Mexicans. I'm talking about comunidades indígenas. I'm talking about, what do you call it? Tepito. I'm talking about all Mexico. I'm not talking about middle-class Mexico and university graduates. University graduates, we need a much higher percentage. University graduates in whatever it is, medicine, engineering, or whatever, we can't, 5% is ridiculous. We need probably 20, 30, 40%. But that's universities, university graduates. Not people who work in stores and clean streets and drive buses and et cetera, et cetera. They don't need English. And they're the majority of the population. So we've had this massification of English language teaching, and so unfortunately, a lot of people are unlikely to need English in schools around Mexico. And yet we've got teaching English down to last year of kinder, I think it is. The PNIAD has become something else now. It's different now, isn't it? It's called something different. But the idea is last year of kinder through to prepper. 13 years of English. And what's it going to produce? In groups of students who have trouble with maths and Spanish, forget English, and who will never need English, they're completely unmotivated and so on. You know, it's a waste of money. It's political. Just as outsourcing is economic. Pista de reciclaje is political. And English for everyone is political. And it doesn't make sense. But in your courses you'll have some people who are actually using English already. You'll have, certainly in the university, you'll have a lot of people who have a probable use of English, and so on. Group size. How many schools in Mexico still have groups of 40, 50, 60? What about Tronco Común in this university? How many students? 40, 50? Yeah? You really think you can teach English, communicative English, to groups of 40, 50? A lot of the students who just don't want to be there. Real levels of the course. By real levels, can I carry? We started about 10 minutes late, right? So I have about 10 minutes? Yeah. When I talk about real levels of the courses, I mean the real level that students reach, not the level of the syllabus, the program, but the level that students really reach. Okay, if the level of the courses only gets up to A1, it's going to be a negative situation, a negative learning situation. Uy, estoy estudiando inglés en la escuela. Mi hermano mayor ya salió de la secundaria y no sabe nada de inglés. Mi hermana mayor todavía ya salió de prepa y no sabe nada de inglés. Y yo estoy empezando a estudiar inglés. ¿A qué nivel llegan los estudiantes de escuelas públicas? ¿A uno, con suerte? Ni siquiera. So, if you go to this language, if you go to the language centers of this university, the students see course 1, course 2, course 3, course 4, course 5. I don't know how many courses there are. And the students going into course 1, they see students in higher courses who really do know more English. They've really learnt some English. So they see I go into course 1, and if I keep at it, I will be like those students in course 3. I will be like those students in course 5. I will be like those students who take PET and pass PET, who take TOEFL IBT and pass TOEFL IBT. It's a positive situation because the students beginning can see the results of students ahead of them. But in public and many private, let's face it, many private schools, in public, primary, secondary, prepper, what do they see? The program in primary is A1, I believe. Do they get to A1? Not many students. The program in secondary is 0 to A2, I believe. Do they get to A2? Not many of them. Prepper. The program in prepper, I believe, is 0 to A2. Do they get to A2? Some of them, a bit more than before, because they're now university students with ambitions, etc., but not many. Tronco común. The program, I believe, is 0 to A2. What are we doing? What are we doing? We need Trump. You're fastening your seatbelts, everybody, for the next 4 years. Drive carefully, fasten your seatbelts. English-speaking staff. So in some centers and places, the students who go into A1 see students really learning English and taking international tests. That's positive. Students who go to some institutions, the only people who speak English in the institution is the English teacher, if you're lucky. And so in many of the public primary and secondary schools, the principal doesn't speak English. 3 English teachers, 2 of them speak English and 1 doesn't really. In primary school, many of the teachers are improvised. When the primary program started, they had pretty good English teachers, but now it's been extended. A lot of the teachers are improvised English teachers. They're really a maths teacher or a Spanish teacher, and they're being improvised as English teachers. So the student who goes to the Anglo, or probably the language centers here in the university, sees, my God, look at that, they're taking first certificate, they're taking TOEFL IBT. The students ahead of me are really, they come out of the classroom and they're speaking English sometimes. And all the teachers speak English, and even some of the administrative staff on the reception, they speak English as well. The student who goes to a public secondary school, the principal, whose older brothers and sisters have been through secondary school and haven't learned English, and who nobody but the English teacher, if you're lucky, speaks English, very negative situation. So we have to create more positive situations. I mean, what could the SEP do? It could say, nobody will become the principal of a public secondary school unless they have B1 level English or another foreign language. That would probably not be practical at this moment. But they could say, people who get the job of principal of a secondary school who have B1 or more English get a bonus. And then later you go to the next step, which is you can't become a principal unless you have B1 level English. And so we need to think of more practical things instead of this globalization of bad ideas. How to train ETs for red contexts. How to train teachers for green contexts. And how to train teachers for children, etc., etc. Well, the licenciatura here in this university needs to consider that and say, how can we incorporate into our university, our licenciatura, concientización de los contextos de enseñanza en inglés en México, y a materia. English language teaching texts in Mexico. Everybody takes it. And the options, and so they're prepared for this. If this is what they get, they're prepared for it. And options for children's teaching and other teaching. Yeah, where is that? A fundamental topic. Context is a fundamental topic, in, not for interlingua courses and Harman Hall courses and Anglo courses necessarily, but certainly for licenciaturas. I think trainees should know what English language teaching contexts are out there. My God, I need the money. It's secondary school, I have to travel to get there, groups of 50 students, but I'll do it for the money. And fortunately, in the licenciatura, they prepared us for that a bit. Don't try too ambitious things. Establish English training issues. What types of ELT are we training our trainees to do? Children's, teenagers, or adults courses, or all of them? Green, grey, or red courses, or all of them? What ELT methodology should we cover and recommend? Depends on the above, length of course, trainee profiles, etc., but always emphasizing classroom English as the basis for everything. I mean, if you could actually get a group of secondary school kids, certainly primary school kids, who understand basic routine classroom discourse. Good morning, children, how are you? How are you? Etc., etc. Okay, stand up, do different TPR things, etc., etc. Open your books to page whatever it is, etc., etc. All of that. If you get a group of secondary, primary school students, etc., who can play games in English, sing songs in English, and respond and understand to all of these classroom dynamic things, you probably will have done much more than failing to teach them the verb to be. What training methodology should we use? Again, depends on length of course, training profiles, etc., but theory and practice based. They've got to understand a bit of the background theory, even if it's a short course. And you've got to have a lot of practice, short course or long course. What kind of practice? Well, PPP has a place, probably still in public schools. I wouldn't say so much in university language centres, and using much more video than before. We're in the age of technology, and everybody's doing this, all sorts of things, you know, and we don't have enough video for teacher training. There should be lots of video. There should be a project for the licenciatura. Go out and video some good primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, these contexts, and have quite a lot of classes and bits of classes and so on. You can then edit them. You don't necessarily want the students to sit through 50 minutes of class, but you get the material of teaching model classes, decent classes in public secondary school, public primary school, Prepper, in Language Center, etc., etc. We need much more video. We're in the age of technology. And we're not using video. Seeing what it's like. Cambridge teacher training courses, the trainers now have to watch lots of videos, I think, as part of their training, don't they? Should people with below B2 level English come in? Time wasted, etc. I said yesterday that anybody interested in taking the licenciatura should be required to have B2 English, B1 English at least, and if they don't have it, provide intensive courses in the Language Center, so they can go to the Language Center, get up to B1 level, preferably B2 level, and then begin the licenciatura, not before. Propedeutico. What to do if we're involved in a political ELT project, like Inglés para todo el mundo, e.g. the globalization trend? Well, I don't know. Okay. I'm just giving you the name of an article I published a long time ago now. When I looked at it, I said, 2009? My God, how time flies. But it touches on some of these issues of this globalization and universalization movement of, teach everybody English. Unfortunately, if you try to teach everybody English, you often end up teaching very few people English. And if you take a different approach, you might get more successful. Thank you very much. You can access the article online. There's an address there. Any questions? Right? Okie dokie. Yes.
Paul, I need advice from you.
Yeah.
My junior high school daughter came back from school yesterday,
Yeah.
very upset.
Right.
She was being taught this, that, this, and those.
Yeah.
And then
Public or private?
Public.
Public.
And then she was drilling some sentences by
Yeah.
herself, saying things like, "How much does the bull cost?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And write. And then she went to the teacher, and the teacher marked everything wrong.
Uh-huh.
And she said, "No, you are doing the difficult way.
Mm-hmm.
Just write how much costs this bull.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it."
Yeah.
And write,
Yeah. Sure.
And write 20 sentences.
So
like
the focus of the teaching was do, does, or this, these, this.
that.
You're right.
That's
Yeah.
it.
It's.
And then what did you do?
Yeah. Yeah. It's. The comment was on her daughter who goes to a public secondary school and was given a homework on this, these, that, those, and she was, being the daughter of her mother, she was doing her homework very carefully, and she did it well, and took it back to the teacher, and the teacher marked everything wrong, because the teacher, in fact, didn't understand the teaching point. This is the problem. We're teaching too much English too badly. We need a new approach to teach English to the people who need it. In that article, the article I had there, my proposal in 2009, I say in the article, I don't believe anybody will do this, but this is what I suggest. Stop teaching English in kindergarten and early primary. The idea that children learn languages well, better than older people, yes they do, in a good context. They learn English, a second language well if they're living in the country, if they have, other people speaking the language around them. But they don't learn English well in a class of 30, 40 students with a teacher who doesn't speak English. And so you're wasting your time with kindergarten. And what you're doing, perhaps, is you're actually increasing the antagonism towards English. You ask students, what's your least favorite subject in school? Some will say math, but many of them will say English. I hate English. Why? Because I've had too many bad English classes. And so that's all I can say there, really. Yeah. And what do you do? What do you do as an English teacher if your daughter, comes back with things marked wrong which are correct? Do you go and complain to the English teacher? It's a waste of time, isn't it? Because the English teacher will still be there as the English teacher and will give your son or daughter a worse grade. So we're teaching too much English in impossible circumstances. And my proposal in that article actually is to have 3 years of school English, I think it is in that article, for everybody. Last year of primary, first 2 years of secondary. And everybody, universal, everybody studies English at school. Last year of primary, where they're still quite young, they haven't become too bad as adolescents yet, and the first 2 years of secondary school, they all have English. Fewer classes, fewer teachers, hopefully we can select better teachers. So all of those 3 years, last year of primary, first 2 years of secondary, they are pretty good teachers, much better than all, because there are fewer teachers. And then establish anybody between the age of, what's third year secondary, 14 or something or other, anybody between the age of 14 and 18, or if you like 20, can go to a language institute free. They can go to Centros de Lenguas de las Universidades, and the CEP pays the university. They can go to CEP language centres. The CEP could establish language centres in schools, etc., etc. They could even go to Interlingua in Harmon Hall, maybe subsidised by the CEP, which is a bit similar to Chile at one time. Chile had cupones or something rather, didn't they? Kind of.
They're going back now.
Yeah, a bit because all the bad teaching went out into the country. I think the countryside was abandoned, and yeah, that's right. Yeah, but we need a more intelligent approach to English language teaching. Right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Paul, on behalf of the Spirit Organizing Committee, would like to present you this small but significant present.
I got my big present yesterday.
During the ceremony, I would like to ask the four of you, Paul, Liberal, may I choose most of the front? For all of your participation.
Platform.
Before this, because it's been 3 great days. We really deeply appreciate your participation in this conference.
compañeros de la Facultad de Lenguas, Autónoma y que hace falta a nivel Latinoamérica, incluyendo aquí representados México, donde se pueda empezar ya a crear ciertos proyectos, ¿no? Que creo que ese fue también otra de las cosas que se observaron en este espacio. Quiero agradecer a nombre de la Universidad de la Benemérita, de la Universidad Autónoma de Puebla, a nuestras autoridades, del director. El director está en un pero nos ha pedido volver a veras mucho su interés en estar aquí en el Centro de Acceso de Lenguas Extranjeras de la Facultad de Lenguas de la Benemérita, Universidad Autónoma de Puebla.
Amén.
Y que sean bienvenidos siempre a esta su casa. Y bueno, agradecer también a nombre de la Facultad a Paula, a David, a Gabriel y a Mari por su interés en estar con nosotros. También no menos agradecer a todos y cada uno de los plenaristas, de los ponentes, de los que se tomaron ese tiempo de mandar sus trabajos y que quieran compartir con nosotros. Son trabajos muy valiosos, son trabajos que ustedes han hecho con un gran esfuerzo y que reconocemos en la temática que se planteó en este congreso, como fueron la formación docente, las políticas, las prácticas docentes, la mentoría, la tecnología, en toda esta dinámica. Sí me gustaría hacer un recuento muy breve. Yo creo que siempre una relatoría breve es muy importante en nuestros eventos y saber cuáles fueron los temas más sobresalientes. No me atrevería a decir que son los más importantes, pero sí algunos de los que pudimos captar y que tanto los plenaristas como los ponentes tocaron, y que yo creo que por favor anotémoslo, veamos qué redes podemos empezar a hacer aquí, qué colaboraciones y futuros proyectos de investigación. Entre los temas que pues hemos detectado aquí fue, por ejemplo, reconceptualizar el rol de los formadores de docentes, ¿sí? Como una profesión, como otras profesiones tan importantes, ¿no? Hay una frase que tomé de Paula que decía que importamos. Realmente los formadores de lenguas somos muy importantes en las universidades y en las instituciones. El otro tema se tocó formadores docentes, como mediadores, mentores, que no solo promueven concientizar a los estudiantes sobre sus prácticas, pero también que promuevan a los estudiantes tomar sus propias decisiones. Eso es muy importante. Y respecto a sus prácticas, y así construir su propio conocimiento respecto a la enseñanza y aprendizaje. Es un tema que también notamos que se tocó en varias ponencias. El otro tema fue reflexionar sobre el dilema, la dicotomía de teoría-práctica en los programas de formación docente, y bueno, cómo abordar los contenidos que se deban de tocar, las prácticas en esos programas de formación docente. El otro tema también es que se tocó, yo creo que en casi todas las ponencias, al menos en las que yo estuve, las que escuché de mis compañeros, que es la importancia de contextualizar las prácticas de los formadores docentes y así las de la enseñanza. El contexto es de suma importancia en todas estas actividades y estar muy conscientes de las particularidades de cada contexto. Eso fue muy importante. Por ende, entonces, me atrevería a decir que estamos ya en un rumbo más o menos común, los que estamos trabajando en esto, y que hace que haya la importancia de formar a nuestros docentes bajo un enfoque sociocultural. Creo que eso fue un tema muy sobresaliente. Parece que vamos por ese rumbo, y lo cual, bueno, nos da mucho gusto verlo. La otra es también revisar. Se ha tocado también muy importante la importancia de la historia de la profesionalización. Paul cerró con este tema, revisar qué ha sucedido en la profesionalización de la formación de formadores, que nos permita entender a ustedes también